President, I return to the floor this week for my 24th edition of Waste of the Week. I've been coming down every week the Congress has been in session during this cycle, talking about waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayers, hard-earned taxpayer dollars. This is the 24th edition, and today I want to highlight improper Medicare payments of taxpayer dollars. Now, we all know that Medicare is important to our older citizens, of which I am one of them. Millions of Americans, tens of millions of Americans depend on Medicare for their health care coverage. And we all know that we have the responsibility here in this body to preserve these important health benefits for those who depend on them. As part of the preserving of these benefits is protecting Medicare from waste, fraud, and abuse. Unfortunately, throughout the history of Medicare, Medicare has been plagued by improper payments. And it's shocking to hear the numbers. The Government Accountability Office has reported that improper Medicare payments totaled nearly $60 billion in 2014 alone. And over the last 10 years, $336 billion of waste, fraud, and abuse in the Medicare system. And this figure does not even include improper payments for certain Medicare programs that have actually not taken place. Examples of Medicare payments includes things like services that are not medically necessary, duplicative billing for services by providers, ineligible practice locations, and spending on services that actually never took place. Yes, actions that never took place have been billed to the government and only discovered later that those reimbursements were fraudulent. And it's rampant. And this is taking money out of hard-earned tax dollars out of American people's pockets. But it's also denying those in Medicare the coverage that they are entitled to under the program. And it is driving Medicare into a road to insolvency that we're going to have to deal with, and I think we should have been dealing with it in present years. But one of the areas that we can deal with now, if we can't summon the political will to recognize the fact that Medicare is careening toward insolvency at some point, which will result in cutting benefits significantly for current members receiving benefits under Medicare, or require massive tax increases to cover the deficit. One of the things that we can do now, since we can't gather the political will to do the other, to my great distress, is at least address those issues where we know that fraud has taken place. Now, I've come down here and talked to, now this is the 24th time, and we have a chart, a thermometer, that we wanted to reach the goal of defining $100 billion of waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, we shot way past that. I mean, you just can't catch up with it in terms of, and these are matters that have been accounted for by the Government Accountability Office. This isn't something Republicans are just making up, or we're drawing something from anecdotal items that appear in the paper or are raised on the talk shows. These are actual waste, fraud, and abuse examples of what we have already documented. And so today, now every once in a while when I come down here, I mean, I could talk about the $60 billion, and we could add $60 billion to our climbing accountability and total of waste, fraud, and abuse. But I like to, every fourth or fifth time, address something that is so egregious, it draws the public attention, to say, we ought to look into this, or to press their elected representatives to do something about this. Can you believe that we are wasting money on something as frivolous as this? And this is an example today that I'm going to raise. The Washington Post recently said in an editorial about improper federal payments, every misstep dollar lining an undeserving pocket is a dollar not available for those who need the help. Now, from time to time, as I've said, I try to raise something that catches the public interest. We've talked about federal grants going to prove that massaging of rabbits, using rabbits as an example, makes them feel better after a strenuous workout. I think most of us could have figured that out without having to spend some $300,000, I think it was even more than that, as a grant to some unbelievable, somebody came to a conclusion that this would be a worthy project in use of taxpayer dollars. That got a lot of attention. But today I want to talk about payments, improper payments made to ambulance suppliers. Medicare coverage allows ambulance transports when a patient's medical condition at the time of transport is such that any other means of transportation would endanger the patient's health. That is, something happens with the patient at home, the spouse says, I'll drive you to the hospital. If you come to the conclusion that no, that potentially could endanger the person's health further, we need to call an ambulance, we need to call 911, we need to transport this person who can have medical care on the way to the hospital. You're eligible under Medicare if you can prove that that's necessary. The transport has to be for a patient to receive a medically necessary medical service and return from that service. So you get transfer both to the medical provider, usually the hospital or the emergency room, and then transfer back to your house if it's medically necessary. As a further requirement, to qualify for the reimbursement, the provider who is providing the ambulance service has to meet specific qualifications in addition to what I have just said. It can only be transportation that takes you to a hospital, skilled nursing facility, dialysis facilities for certain patients, and then take them back home after they've received the care. And even with these guidelines, unfortunately, fraud is taking place and millions of taxpayer dollars are being wasted. A recent report by the Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees Medicare, found that Medicare made $207 million in questionable ambulance services payments during the first half of the previous year when this was investigated. Shockingly, these payments include $30 million of Medicare paid for transports in which the beneficiaries did not receive any Medicare services at either the time of pickup or drop-off or at the locations or anywhere else. Why? Because they weren't even in the ambulance. These are fraudulent charges made, sent to Washington, reimbursements made to the ambulance service, and they weren't even taking any patients. So can you imagine an ambulance, lights flashing, going down the road, on the way to the hospital, cars pulling over to the side, as we are required to do. Oh, somebody's in there, they're in danger. I mean, their health is at risk. Get them to the emergency room. Oh, that poor person needs dialysis and they don't have means of transportation. No, these are empty ambulances with lights flashing, cars pulling over. Nobody's inside except the employees. And then they're billing the government and getting reimbursements for the trip, out and back. $207 million of documented illegal reimbursements, improper billing for these services. So once again, and you say, well, let me just give you one example. One of the ambulance services, see if I can find where I am on my notes here so I don't misidentify who that is. One of those services is a Pennsylvania company that fraudulently billed Medicare $3.6 million for transports, and the supplier recruited patients and did not require any transport, and they made a deal with them. And they said, look, we're going to have to use your name to submit the billing for reimbursement. And we know that you don't need the transport for anything, but we need to kind of document this so we can get our money back. And by the way, so what we'll do is we'll give you part of the reimbursement. We'll bribe you. Not bribe you, we will pay you some of the money that we get if you will allow us to use your name and identity, maybe your Social Security number or whatever, your Medicare card number, and you're going to be in on the deal. So if you get a call from an inspector or from somebody trying to verify this reimbursement, yeah, I had to go to the dialysis, or I had to go to the hospital, or yes, that was legitimate. So this company finally was identified, $3.6 million for transport that did not meet coverage requirements. And you say, okay, well, that's one-off. I mean, you know, a company fraud, we read about that in the paper. The Inspector General found that 1 of every 5 suppliers had questionable billing practice. 1 of every 5. And that's how it totals up to $207 million. So clearly, this is a problem that has to be addressed. And if addressed, we can save the taxpayer money, or we can make sure that this money is going to cover necessary medical treatment for those under Medicare, and slow down the plunge with 10,000 retirees every day entering Medicare, slow down the rush, the movement toward insolvency that we're going to have to deal with here in the Congress and should have been dealing with before. So by putting these proper safeguards in place, over $207 million in questionable ambulance services can be eliminated and taxpayers' dollars could be saved. This is a small addition to an ever-growing list of savings to the taxpayer if we can eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. And so I bring up my chart. As I said before, we used to have a thermometer here, or a guide that showed as we were creeping up, and it went so high it's going to keep going to the ceiling. We now are at a total of $141,000 and change in terms of waste, fraud, and abuse. And we'll be back next week for the next installment. Many more to come. Mr. President.